This morning, you probably ate something made from crushed grass seeds, mixed with water, and set near fire. You call it bread. You do not think about it twice. But the real story of that slice on your plate is far stranger than you have ever been told. It starts 14,400 years ago, in a stone hut in the Jordanian desert, long before anyone had planted a single crop on purpose, long before the word farmer meant anything at all. You would assume bread required farming first. Seeds, fields, harvests, all in careful order. That assumption is wrong, and the truth changes what you think farming even is. In 2018, archaeologist Amaya Aranzo-Tigi and her team were digging through a site called Shabaka 1, a scatter of stone structures in the Black Desert of northeastern Jordan. Inside one fireplace, they found blackened crumbs. Charred, tiny, almost invisible to the naked eye. Under a scanning electron microscope, those crumbs revealed something impossible for their time period. A structure of starch granules, air pockets, and fibrous plant tissue, stretched and puffed in a pattern that only forms one way: baking. Here is the number that matters. 4,000 years. That is how long before agriculture officially began that this bread existed. Your ancestors were baking loaves while still living as hunter-gatherers, wandering after herds, gathering wild grass by hand, with no fields, no ownership of land, no concept of a harvest season locked into a calendar. Think about what that means for your own body right now. Every time you reach for toast, you are repeating an act older than the wheel, older than the city, older than writing. You are performing one of the oldest deliberate transformations a human being ever learned to do to raw plant matter, and you are doing it without a single thought. But why bread? Why not just eat the seeds? Wild einkorn wheat and wild barley grow across the Fertile Crescent in dense green stands, especially after a wet spring. A person could strip the seed heads by hand and chew them raw. It would work. It would be edible. So why go through the trouble of grinding, mixing, and heating something you could just as easily swallow whole? The answer sits in your gut, not in your taste buds. Raw grains are wrapped in a hard outer coat, a tough shell built by the plant specifically to survive being eaten. Your digestive system cannot break that coat down efficiently. Chew it all you like. Much of the nutrition simply passes straight through you and wasted on the way out. Grinding cracks that shell open. Water and heat unlock the starch trapped inside, turning a nearly indigestible seed into something your body can absorb almost completely. In blunt terms, an unprocessed grain barely feeds you. A ground and cooked one feeds you dramatically more, from the exact same handful of seeds pulled from the exact same field. That single discovery multiplied the value of a grass patch overnight, and it did so without adding a single new plant to the landscape. Archaeobotanist George Wilcox has spent decades studying grinding stones recovered from Fertile Crescent sites, and his work shows something quietly staggering. Those first stone querns, the flat grinding slabs used to crush grain, carry patterns from repeated, daily, almost obsessive use. Not the occasional grind of a curious forager testing an idea once. The repeated grind of a person whose next meal now depends on this exact motion, hour after hour, season after season. Once your ancestors realized that crushing seeds unlocked far more energy than eating them raw, everything about their daily rhythm changed. Wild grass was no longer a backup snack for a lean week. It became a target, a resource worth returning to again and again, at the exact same patches of hillside, tracked the way you might track the location of a favorite restaurant. And that is the part almost nobody tells you. This is where farming actually begins. Not with a seed pressed hopefully into soil, but with a grinding stone, wearing smooth from thousands of repetitive strikes, long before anyone thought to plant anything on purpose. You picture the invention of agriculture as a single, bold moment. A person kneeling in a field, pressing a seed into the earth for the first time, watching it sprout with quiet, historic triumph. That image is comforting. It belongs in a museum diorama. It is also almost entirely false. The real sequence ran backward from what you were taught in school. Humans did not start farming and then invent bread as a clever use for the surplus grain. Humans invented bread first, while still hunting and gathering, and only later, as demand for that flour kept climbing year after year, did some groups begin protecting, then tending, then finally planting the very grasses they had already been harvesting wild for generations. Bread came before the farm. The farm was built to keep the bread coming. Not the other way around, and not by accident. By hunger, repeated often enough to become a system. Consider what that means for the stakes involved, because this is where the danger enters the story. A wild patch of einkorn wheat only produces so much seed in a season, no matter how badly it is needed. If a growing group of people is now grinding that grain daily, harvesting it faster than it naturally reseeds itself, the patch will thin out. Some years, under drought or overharvest, it may fail entirely. And a failed patch, for a group whose whole rhythm now revolves around flour, is not a minor inconvenience. It is a direct threat to survival through the coming winter, when wild food of any kind becomes scarce and unreliable. That pressure, the fear of an empty grinding stone with no grain left to feed it, may be exactly what pushed some communities toward deliberate planting for the very first time. Not idle curiosity about how seeds grow. Necessity, sharpened by hunger, sharpened further by memory of a bad year that nearly broke them. Here is where the twist gets stranger still, and this is the part that should make you pause mid-bite. Archaeobotanist Dorian Fuller, working with genetic and morphological evidence pulled from early Neolithic sites across the Near East, has traced how long it actually took wild wheat to become domesticated wheat, the kind of tough, non-shattering seed head that holds its grain tightly instead of scattering it to the wind the moment it ripens. His research suggests the transition unfolded over roughly 1,000 to 2,000 years. Not a single clever afternoon in a field. A slow, unconscious selection process, repeated across dozens of human generations, each one unknowingly favoring the plants that happened to be easiest to harvest and grind, without anyone ever deciding to breed a new species on purpose. Your ancestors were not trying to invent agriculture. They were trying to keep making bread. Agriculture was the accidental byproduct of a much simpler, much more urgent goal, keeping the crushed grain paste flowing onto the hot stone, meal after meal, without interruption. Before you widen the lens further, sit with one more detail from that Jordanian site, because it changes the identity of the people involved. The community at Shabaka 1 belonged to a culture archaeologists call the Natufians, a group that lived roughly 15,000 to 11,000 years ago across the Levant. They are famous in academic circles for something specific. They were among the first people on Earth to build permanent stone houses while still technically classified as hunter-gatherers. Round huts, storage pits, fixed hearths, not a campsite. A home meant to be returned to season after season. Now ask yourself why a hunter-gatherer group would bother building a permanent stone house at all. Wandering groups do not need architecture. They need to move light and move fast, following game and rainfall across open country. Something was already anchoring the Natufians to one patch of land before farming ever existed, and the breadcrumbs in that hearth are a strong clue about what that something was. Widen the lens further still, because the consequences did not stop at one hut in the desert. Once a group commits to grinding grain as a primary food source, its entire social structure begins to bend around that commitment, whether anyone intends it to or not. Grinding by hand, using flat stone querns, takes hours of repetitive labor every single day, far more time than gathering the raw seeds ever did. Someone has to do it day after day, without pause. Archaeologist Thea Mollison, studying skeletal remains from later Neolithic villages, documented pronounced changes in the arm bones, shoulders, and knees of the people who performed this labor, changes consistent with years spent kneeling and grinding in a fixed, repetitive posture. A physical cost, quite literally baked into the bones of the people who kept the invention running. Bread did not just feed people. It reshaped their bodies, their daily labor, and eventually, their settlements. A resource worth grinding daily is a resource worth staying near. Staying near a grain patch, generation after generation, watching it, defending it, eventually improving it, is one of the quiet ingredients that help tip nomadic groups toward permanent villages, long before anyone used the word village to describe what they were building. So the cost of not solving the grain problem was never simply going hungry for a single season. It was losing the very anchor that was starting to hold a group of families in one place, together, near one reliable food source, instead of scattering back into the older rhythm of constant wandering that had defined humanity for hundreds of thousands of years before. That is a much higher stake than what's for dinner tonight. A hungry group can wait out one bad night. A group that has restructured its entire social rhythm around a single grinding stone cannot wait out an entire failed season without consequences that ripple through every family involved. But the story does not stay contained in the Fertile Crescent, And this is where the scale of the twist becomes almost dizzying. Once the pattern of grinding, baking, and gradually taming grain proved itself in one region, versions of the same basic sequence appeared, independently, on nearly every inhabited continent. Rice in the Yangtze River Valley of China, domesticated over thousands of years by communities pursuing the exact same efficiency gain. Maize in the highlands of Mexico, painstakingly reshaped from a wild grass called tia sinti, with a cob barely the size of your thumb, into the dense, calorie-rich crop it is today. Millet and sorghum across parts of Africa. Different grains, different continents, different centuries, yet the same underlying trade unfolding again and again. Crush the seed, unlock the calories, then reorganize your entire way of life around protecting the source of those calories. That repetition matters. It tells you this was not a one-time accident of a single clever group in the Jordanian desert. It was something closer to an inevitable outcome, waiting to be discovered anywhere humans live near wild grasses long enough, and not on the same nagging question, how do you get more food out of the same patch of ground? And here is the reframe that should genuinely unsettle you. You have likely heard bread called the foundation of civilization. That phrase gets repeated so often in textbooks that it stops meaning anything at all. But look at the actual sequence again, slowly, and it reads less like a foundation and more like an addiction with excellent long-term returns. Your ancestors discovered a food that gave dramatically more energy for the exact same amount of raw material gathered from the exact same hillside. Their bodies crave that energy, the way any body craves an efficient calorie source. Their daily routines reorganized around getting more of it. Their settlements formed near the source, tighter and more permanent with each passing generation. Their labor divided sharply around processing it, one group grinding while others hunted, gathered, or built. Within a few thousand years, an entire way of life, permanent villages, stored surplus, shared granaries, eventually walled cities, had grown out of the simple repeated act of crushing seeds between two stones. You are not eating a symbol of stability when you eat bread. You are eating the original habit-forming technology, the one that first taught a wandering species to stay put, to build walls, to store grain against a bad year, and to measure wealth in something that could be counted, hoarded, and defended. Now bring it back to you, standing in your kitchen this morning, half awake, reaching for the bread bin without a second thought. When you tear off a piece of bread, your jaw meets almost no resistance. The starch has already been broken down for you, first by grinding, then by heat, exactly the same two steps discovered in that Jordanian hut 14 millennia ago, refined 1,000 times over, but never fundamentally replaced. Your body still responds to that pre-processed energy exactly the way theirs did, with a fast, satisfying rise in blood sugar, a small immediate hit of reward that arrives before you have even finished chewing. That is not a coincidence. That is 14,000 years of selection, both biological and cultural, converging quietly on the exact texture sitting in your hand right now. Every soft, springy, easily torn bite has been optimized, generation after generation, patch after patch, grinding stone after grinding stone, long before anyone understood the words starch or gluten or fermentation, purely by watching which loaf disappeared fastest and which field kept people alive through the leanest months. Consider, too, what happened once bread stopped being just food and started being currency. In later Bronze Age societies across Mesopotamia, ration texts from cities like Uruk and Ur record standardized loaves handed out to workers as literal payment, a fixed number of loaves per day of labor, tracked and recorded on clay tablets by scribes whose entire job existed because grain now needed counting. Egyptologist Rosalind Hall and others studying tomb inscriptions from ancient Egypt have documented bread and beer, both made from the same ground grain, listed among the most common offerings buried with the dead, food considered essential enough to carry into the afterlife itself. A crushed seed and a splash of water had traveled from a desert hearth to becoming the literal unit of a wage, then to a gift for the gods, then to a requirement for the underworld. That is the real arc of the invention. Not a single triumphant moment. A slow-motion takeover spreading outward from stomach to habit to economy to religion until an entire civilization organized its labor, its money, and even its idea of the afterlife around a technique first worked out by hungry people crushing wild grass on a stone in the desert. Here is the question worth sitting with for a moment. If the desire for more bread quietly rearranged where humans lived, how they divided labor, and how long they stayed in one place, what does that suggest about the other conveniences shaping your life today? The ones that feel small, that feel like background noise, that you also do not think about twice. Your phone, your car, your morning coffee. Even the refined sugar sitting in your cupboard, another crushed plant product your body has learned to crave with unsettling speed. How many of those started the exact same way, as a small efficiency that quietly rewired everything around it, long before anyone noticed the rewiring was even happening? Think about the modern version of that same ration tablet. Your paycheck arrives on a fixed schedule, a set amount tracked in a system, exchanged for the exact number of hours you gave that day, the way a Bronze Age worker once exchanged labor for a counted stack of loaves. The unit changed. Coins, then currency, then a number on a screen. The underlying logic, work traded for a measured, storable food surplus, has not actually changed in 5,000 years. You did not domesticate wheat on purpose. Your ancestors barely did either. It happened because a small technology, grinding stone plus heat, made an ordinary resource extraordinarily efficient, and once a species finds an efficiency like that, it rarely lets go of it, not for 4,000 years, not for 14,000, not ever, as long as the reward keeps landing exactly on schedule. This morning, you ate something made from crushed grass seeds, mixed with water, and set near fire. You called it breakfast. But what you actually held in your hand was the oldest surviving habit of your entire species, still running 14,000 years later, exactly as designed.